Nope. Let's see. Keep going. Those are the Mormons. We don't want that one.
There it is.
Oh, it's the third one. Oh, yeah, let's do it. It's going to be gorgeous in here, too. Oh. So the words are the Lord's Prayer, but it's been translated into Swahili. I don't even know what those guys were saying at the end, but it seems like they were pretty positive about Jesus. So, I mean, I thought that part was pretty great. But amazing song and this interpretation. You know, one of the first times I heard the Lord's Prayer ever sung as a kid, it was Jim Neighbors. Anybody remember that? Yeah, like that was one of the things he really did. I've been putting in one of these Lord's Prayer in each one of the devotionals we're doing every week, every night, every day. And I ran into one from Frank Sinatra. I mean, who knew, right, way back that he had done a Lord's Prayer? And there's an Elvis one out there that's, that he did. But then this one, really unique, and just written in 2005. That song won the Grammy in 2005, and I didn't know it. There's a version that's a cappella, which was incredible, but there's actually an orchestrated version, and that's the one that won the Grammy in 2005. But it's got the Lord's Prayer as the words underneath it. They just happen to be in Swahili. Well, I'm really glad that you're here. Y'all know that Bobby and Cindy are kind of under the weather, and so we're kind of working without them tonight. Also, the other two ladies are on vacation this week, so Julie and I are going to lead you in our hymns tonight.
We're going to sing a duet.
Uh-huh, yeah.
One of my favorite hymns is In the Garden, Sing It With Me. I come to Hallelujah. I stay in the garden with him, though the night around me be falling, but he bids me go through the voice of woe. His voice to me is calling, and he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. And then another one of my favorites is Victory in Jesus. So let's sing that one. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning. Then I repented of my sin and won the victory. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his redeeming blood. He loved me ere I knew him, and all my love is to him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood.
Awesome. Thanks, Julie. That was really
I didn't
great.
hear you, honey. I didn't hear you.
Oh no, Nathan turned me off. He knows better than lead me up while I'm singing. All right, tonight we're gonna think a little bit about the work of the Jesuits, and we're all aware of the things about Catholicism that are not right, but there were some things that they did in those early days that were pretty great, and it's at least good for us to be informed about them. So we're going to take a look at the Jesuits. I'm actually leading Class 101 tonight. The plan was for Bobby to pick up here at the end, but he went and got COVID, so not great planning on his part. He could have got it 3 or 4 weeks ago, but he completely mistimed this thing. So David's going to take us at the end and wrap things up for us tonight.
I grew up in circles where people started talking about the beginning of modern missionary activity with William Carey. And William Carey was an estimable person who did an awful lot, but he was late on the scene. Francis Xavier dies in the early 1540s. He's already been to the western coast of India. He's been to southern India. He's been to Malaysia. He has overseen the really important conversion of Japanese, and he dies waiting to go into China.
I want to tell you about the formation of a remarkable company. It was started by a small group of friends who met at university. And this was at a time of incredible change and disruption across society. These friends lacked connection or capital. and yet they started a company that would have a global footprint. There are now more than 16,000 people involved in over 100 countries. It took significant commitment and courage from this small group and their staff. The company was started in 1534. Their founder was Ignatius Loyola, and the name they chose was the Company of Jesus, that became known as the Jesuits. The 16th century was a period of global change. First, the world was expanding through exploration. Second, there was explosive growth of the Protestant church across Europe due to the Reformation. And third, the invention of the printing press created an information revolution. This was a period of great disruption. The impact of the early Jesuits, such as Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, and Matteo Ricci, continue to influence the church and the world today. We want to explore Ignatius Loyola, or Ignatius of Loyola. Give us his background as a young man.
Ignatius Loyola grew up in the Basque region of northern Spain. Loyola was the family name, the crest, and it was a noble family. So as a nobleman, he had noble pursuits. He dressed very fine. He liked the company of women. He liked the games of chivalry. So I think he was typical of that generation.
His idea is he's going to be a military hero and a ladies' man.
I don't think he was a great soldier because he suffered a fairly bad wound. A cannonball went through a wall and hit him and fractured his leg. And that's what brought an end to his military career. And that's really the cathartic moment in his life.
He undergoes a profound conversion experience, and then, for longer than a decade, goes through what I would call a kind of a journey of self-reinvention, self-discovery.
He heals from that injury, but if you've ever seen pictures of 16th century Europe, particularly northern Spain, the attire, the legs were like leggings. They were very tight. No, most men wouldn't wear those today, but they were very common then. And so the battle injury made his leg look disfigured. And he said, what woman would look at me with a leg like this? So he actually went to his doctors and said, break it and reset it so it looks good.
With no anesthesia, you can't imagine that, can you?
Now there's an English author, Margaret Silf, who's written on Ignatius, and she says, he's the only saint who's had cosmetic surgery, who's had work done. But he did that because he wanted to maintain his look. And it was in that second rehabilitation he was bored.
And for some time, there's a literal journey. He makes a pilgrimage to a famous shrine near Barcelona, goes to the Holy Land.
He became from really a man of chivalry to a homeless man. So when you see homeless people on the street, imagine you go from dressing like a Wall Street banker to a homeless person. But that was his way, because he felt the conversion called him to something like that. So he went to a place called Manresa, more in the Catalonia area of Spain, and he spent over 30 days in a cave, begging for food and water. And it's there that he had this mystical experience called his spiritual exercises, and probably one of the greatest things he's written.
He has some clarity about a couple of things. He knows that he wants to serve the Lord, and that's going to be the number one priority in his life.
He wanted then to go the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he went, but he was naive. He thought he had this profound conversion. He was going to go to Jerusalem and convert all Muslims. And the Franciscans said, they kind of put their arm around him and they said, go back to Europe. Almost as if to say, you're not ready for prime time. And so after that, he came to the realization he had to learn more.
He goes to university, and he's really on fire to share the gospel. So he gets together a band of brothers, you might say, who then are committed to going to the ends of the earth. So this is a group that takes on the name the Jesuits.
The one thing I'll say for now is a lot of times when people start a company or a religious group, you start it to do a specific thing. Like, we're all believers and we really want to serve the poor, let's start a soup kitchen, or let's start a school so we can help educate folks, or let's start a church. And they don't have any such clarity their mission they describe colloquially as to help souls.
There were about 9 first companions. So some of the earliest companions, Ignatius Loyola, Francis Xavier, the Frenchman Peter Faber. Faber was actually a priest, so they had already an ordained priest among their midst. Another Spaniard, Diego Lainez. So these were some of the first group of 9 who came together and realized that maybe there was something more than a fraternity or a friendship here. First, they decided to take religious vows, and they did that in Paris. They went to Hill Montmartre, so they went up there, the Chapel of Saint Denis, and there on August 15th, they took their first vows. And I think Ignatius had his comeuppance because he really wanted to go back to the Holy Land. I think there was a part of him that wanted to say to the Franciscans, I'm ready now. And so the port to Jerusalem was Venice, so they went to Venice. But a number of factors, civil infractions, etc., prevented their journey. So they were on the streets of Venice for a year. And something significant happened. Ignatius said, well, we're not just going to sit here and wait. Let's go to the hospitals, let's go to the poor neighborhoods, and let's minister to people. So in a sense, ministry found them despite what they were looking for.
Chris, how did Christian faith become a part of your life?
I was born into the Christian faith. My parents are, they're both passed away now, but they're immigrants from Ireland. And, so grew up as your classic, traditional, Catholic, ethnic Irish childhood in urban New York, altar boy, singing in the choir, this kind of thing. And then I ended up going to a high school run by the Jesuits, which is a religious order of Catholic priests. And I admire what these guys are doing. I think this would be an attractive life for me that I could do well. And so off I went to the seminary of the Jesuits.
I grew up in a very Catholic family. My father, of Polish descent, but a U.S. citizen. My mother from Italy. And I studied at a Jesuit university. And it's there that I first met Jesuits. But at the age of 19, in my second year of university, I was invited to make the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola, which had a deep impact on me. And then when I visited the Jesuit novitiate, where Jesuits are formed, I said, I feel a call to this. And so I would say I started at the age of 21 by filling out an application and entering the order. And 35 years later, I think it's been a good fit.
So I lasted 7 years. Jesuits are famous within the Catholic Church for a very long formation.
It takes a decade to say to form a Jesuit. Don't take this the wrong way, but what takes so long?
Well, some say we're slow. I like to say we take a lot of time. So there's 2 years of novitiate, which is really separating yourself from the world as you knew it and seeing if you can fit into religious life. After 2 years, then you take your vows and you live as a Jesuit. A lot of study, so 2 to 3 years of philosophy. I studied mostly philosophy, political theory, teach for 3 years, which I did at the secondary school level, then study theology, and that brings you to 10. You're ordained, and then there's studies in addition to that to in a sense, prepare you for the specific work you might be doing.
Was it difficult to leave?
It was difficult. To decide. I began to become a little discontent, and I kind of pushed that off. In life, who's happy all the time, And at a certain point, I said to myself, okay, look, this is not normal. You gotta pray about this. You have to think about this. And once I decided to decide, so to speak, it was clear to me almost right away, what the issue was and what the decision was.
There's several things that are really interesting about the early history of the Jesuits that all Christian people, Protestants, Pentecostals, everybody should be thinking about. The Jesuits and Catholics in general were far, far ahead of Protestants in missionary activity because of their dedication, but also because of the geopolitical situation. They are the key religious energy in the reforming Catholicism of the 16th century, which is aided and abetted by the major European powers of the time, particularly France, Portugal, and Spain. France, Portugal, and Spain are expanding their reach around the globe, And they take with them their religious advisors, their ministers, who are Catholic priests and sometimes members of the orders. And then, to me, the most remarkable thing about the early Jesuits and other Catholic missions is their willingness to go out beyond the protection of the European powers. And that advancing, that became eventually a model for other Christian missionary efforts.
So we see the Jesuits going to China, to Vietnam, to India, to the First Nations in Canada and North America, to Latin America. They also try to convert Protestants in Europe. They were actually a very effective conversionary force to reconvert Protestants to Catholicism after the Protestant Reformation.
What did you then go on to do?
Well, after I left the Jesuits, I did the logical thing that anybody would do. I went to work in investment banking at JP Morgan. And so I really didn't have a plan. I had a plan A, to be a priest. I hadn't really worked out a plan B or thought a lot about it. I was teaching economics. Jesuits have a vow of poverty, so I had nothing. And probably my idea was, I'm in New York City, a lot of big banks. They have training programs. I'll catch on in one of these places, hopefully. And once I have my feet under me, then I'll kind of decide what my life should be. But then, as it turned out, I was happy, and I ended up staying there for a number of years, 17 years actually.
You crossed across your experience with the Jesuits and your business experience by writing the book Heroic Leadership. How did that come about?
So I worked at JP Morgan for altogether 17 years and was lucky enough to spend time in Japan, Singapore, London. So I had a wonderful career, and I had decided that I long had this idea of writing a book of some kind which would think about the Jesuits from a leadership perspective.
What are the values that we could explore there?
As I looked at the Jesuits and their history and so on, I encapsulated part of their core values and culture in 4 ideas. One, the idea of being self-aware. You have to be, you have to make some foundational investment in understanding your sense of purpose, your strengths, your weaknesses, your values, why you're on earth, how we should treat humans, this whole suite of things that add up to what I would call a self-aware person.
In the area of self-aware, it was Ignatius Loyola's disciplines that became important there for him and for Jesuits.
So when the Jesuits were starting, most religious orders are what we today would call monastic. You know, like in other words, the classic idea people have of monks in a monastery. They come together, they pray every day together, multiple times each day, they rarely leave. And so it's quite easy to imagine how they stayed recollected, huh? But Ignatius had this idea that the Jesuits would instead be much more world immersed.
I think Ignatius had a line, a maxim that every Jesuit knows: the world is good. So many monasteries were built on a hill or in a valley to escape the world. Not that they were bad. It's like, we're going to go away from the world to pray for the world. Ignatius said, no, go live in the world, and that everything in the world can be used for good. So that's why Jesuits gravitate toward technology, everything, because they're not evil in and of themselves. They can lead to evil, but they can also lead to good. So he loved the world.
Now, one of the secrets to their success was their intense spirituality. They had a spirituality that allowed them as individuals to survive in any different cultural context because of their intense spiritual exercises. So they didn't have to live in a monastery with other people to survive as Christians.
A second value would be the idea of ingenuity. In other words, the world's going to keep changing, and while we have some beliefs and values that may never change, we also, away from those, need to be able to adapt to a changing world, or we're never going to be successful, we're never going to lead well.
In the area of ingenuity, is Matteo Ricci an example of that and what he did as he went to China?
Yes, I use him in the book as an exemplar of this idea of ingenuity, and that's usually the value that people in a secular businessy context have no trouble appreciating. I mean, the world is a maelstrom, and if you can't be adaptive, you're not going to survive, But I think to come to grips as people who are believers with, okay, what here is the non-negotiables of my belief, and can I be free enough and adaptive enough to be able to distinguish between what can and sometimes should change in response to changing environments, and on the other hand, recognize and honor what I can't change.
Now, he's a unique character, isn't he? And what he did in China was unique.
Yeah, he's really remarkable. He had an amazing capacity to learn and absorb the world around him. And so he quickly assessed what was going on in China, and early on, he noticed that people who were religious figures were these Buddhist monks, and so he adopted their dress and tried to look like them, act like them.
What do you reckon motivated Ricci?
He and this early group of Jesuit missionaries decided that in East Asia, they were not going to just reproduce Christianity as they knew it in Europe. They were going to have to do something different. They were entering cultures that were extremely sophisticated and complex and had long histories. So they needed to find out, how has God already been active and working here? And so Ricci, for instance, begins to use a name for God that had been in Chinese texts for over 2,000 years and says, God has been here. You've known him as heaven or the Lord of heaven. Now let me tell you more about him.
They came with the black robes, and then they realized, we look alien, we look foreign. So they allowed the people to dress them. And yeah, so the pictures of Matteo Ricci dressed in the splendor of what one would have worn in the Forbidden City in the court of the emperor, because he knew that was part of enculturation. You have to embrace a culture as well as share your own.
Now, that wasn't universally popular, though, was it?
No. One of the things Ricci got into trouble for is something called the Chinese rites controversy. So the way the Mass was celebrated. So, for example, they wouldn't have had grape wine, they would have had rice wine, things, all sorts of things like that to say, can Catholicism be practiced differently in China than it is in Europe? And, again, in an era of great conformity and regimented approach, no. And so, yes, the missionaries always come with tension and conflict.
A third pillar, a third value I spoke about was the idea of heroism. I didn't mean it in the sense of saving people in battlefields, rather that fundamentally you'd live in such a way that you cared about something bigger than yourself.
Yep. Their going to the ends of the earth was actually heroic leadership.
Yeah. I use the word heroism. They use a phrase like majus, or for God's greater glory, and it's if you want a biblical site, you might think of like this. Remember the story of the pearl of great price, and I'll sell everything else I have in order to go for that. That kind of spirit, that we want to be totally open to pursuing what will be for God's greater glory here, and it's not going to bother me to give up the ways we've been doing it before if we see something that's for the majus,
Even before the permission is granted, maybe it's because of the first organizing desire to preach in and around Jerusalem. Jesuits are all on the move. One of them is Francis Xavier. By the time the Jesuits are officially approved as a missionary order, or as just an order in the Catholic Church, he is off the coast of India, exploring what can be done to broadcast the message of Christ as he understands it in the heat of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation, what it's like in India.
So there was only a few of them. They were in a neighborhood in Rome, and there was another Spaniard, Bobadilla, who was supposed to go to the east, which would have been India. Bobadilla got sick, and so the two good friends decided, no, I think Xavier should go.
How long did it take to get there?
It easily would take months if you were lucky enough to make it. I mean, in some years, a third of voyagers would die in these voyages. I mean, imagine these ships in those days about the size of a train car, no sense of, their navigation was primitive. They didn't understand both longitude and latitude, so they wouldn't have ever had a very specific idea where the heck they were. So this kind of fervor of, yes, I'm willing to sacrifice myself in this great holy adventure, One of the leaders of that next generation has the phrase that the ideal Jesuit is living with one foot raised, which is a really great phrase, and everybody always loves that phrase, no matter if they're a Jesuit in another religious tradition, somebody who doesn't believe in anything but is working in J.P. Morgan, because it really captures, I think, the spirit that we all want to bring to what we're doing, whether it's raising my family or working in a company or working in a church. Can I have one foot raised, meaning ready to go where the opportunity is now, and always on the lookout for where's the opportunity.
Xavier boarded a boat with his black cassock. He had his Bible, his prayer books, some provisions, a crucifix. That was it. And there was a group of them that would have gone, and it would have been a long journey by sea to India, because then there was no Suez Canal, there was the rites of passage we have now. And there he shows up on the eastern banks of the Indian shore and brings the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Finally, love, that we treat other people in a way that respects their values and their human potential and tries to develop their potential.
The last of the four around love, I mean, that's kind of what you expect from a church, Christian faith organization. What did love mean for them?
Yeah, so Ignatius, the way Ignatius articulates it is, he says, a manager, in his words, a superior, should govern with greater love than fear. And, it's interesting to me, some of the ideas I talk about in a business perspective, people would have no trouble, with, of course we need to be ingenious, we need to adapt. But the idea of loving people on the team, and even when I wrote those ideas, I imagined people like on trading floors at J.P. Morgan and how they're gonna make of this. And, interestingly enough, nobody has ever objected to that idea. And I found it most validated in the toughest environments, weirdly enough. Like, in other words, a general in the US, retired now, that I really admire a lot, Eric Shinseki, one of his great lines was, you have to love those you lead before you can be an effective leader. Really powerful idea. Above all, it's this idea of, to me, it's this idea of, something, it's not all about me. And even people who are very devout are subject to the same human viruses and snares that affect every human being. In other words, we get caught up in my status, my ego, my greed, the way I want it, the way I want to control things, my legacy, all this nonsense. And to me, when I talk about heroism, part of it is to be able to get over yourself, and say, okay, look, well, you say you're here for a purpose greater than self, and, really, are you?
Am I on? Yeah. I feel like the Cowboys were with their quarterbacks. I'm third string. Anyway, Jesuits, kind of an interesting organization. There were two things that they had to do. One was an initial process, and then the other one was much longer. What were the two functions that they performed when you first got into being a Jesuit? Anybody remember? Study? Okay, yeah, study. And that was the one where it was very long. It was like 10 years, and then they had more studies even beyond that. So, yeah, absolutely. The other one was just before that. Yeah, similar to that, it was where they had to set themselves apart from what their former life was. Set themselves apart from the world. Now, there is a word that we use in Christianity, and it's a process. we think of, there's two things that there's three aspects of a Christian life. The first one is when we accept the Lord, as we believe and we make that decision, and that's known, we're justified. So that's a term we use then. And when we die and we become, with Jesus, we're glorified. But there's something in between, and it's that process. What's the term we use there? Sanctified, absolutely. So that's what he's talking about there. You have to sanctify yourself. So, like Pastor Brent said at the beginning, there's some principles in the Jesuits that make a lot of sense, that really go along with what we believe as well. And one of them is that sanctification. And, you often hear that when you talk about somebody's character, you say, you look at a tombstone and here's the date they were born and here's the date they died, but it's that dash in between that's really identifies the character of that person. And so that's what sanctification is all about, setting ourselves apart. But it's interesting the way when you think about the Catholicism and you think about their way of life, think about when they look to get into a particular position, whether it's a priest or whether it's a nun or whether it's a monk. What do you think of when you think of their titles and their positions? You think of kind of like earthly changes. In other words, there are things like, okay, a priest doesn't marry, a nun doesn't marry, a monk. Okay, think about a monk now. Not the show Monk. I don't know if you've ever seen that on TV, the show Monk. That was always a good one. But when you think of a monk, what do you think of when you think of them? Celibacy. Yeah, celibacy, and you think of isolation. Ooh, they're in this monastery. Now, it's interesting. Back in 2012, my wife and I had the opportunity to take a trip to Israel with the First Baptist Church Allen. And there was this area where we were going off to the edge of this chasm. And as soon as we got to the edge, it wasn't what you saw across on the other side, it was what you saw on the other wall. The wall of this chasm, carved in the wall, was a monastery. It was absolutely fantastic seeing this, and it was really quite beautiful. And my wife said, that's where I want to retire. And it's not that she wanted to be a monk, but it was just the beauty of their monastery. And so, but yeah, you think of, with a monk, you think of isolation. But what was different about the Jesuits? What was the term? What was referenced about the Jesuits that made them different than most of the other Catholic organizations? Yeah, they used the term world immersed. So yeah, they wanted to get with the people. And that was another principle that was very much like Christianity, is the fact that you don't isolate yourself away from the world. Sanctification isn't removing yourself entirely from the world. It's setting yourself apart, but yet still being with the world. Not part of the world, but being with them so you can still witness to them and still communicate with them and still share the gospel with them. So yeah, that was different about their group. That was totally different than what the other Catholic organizations were like. So that was kind of interesting about that aspect of it there. Both, as far as the intense spirituality, yeah, the monks were that way and the Jesuits were that way, but the difference was the isolation versus the being, working within the world, within the world themselves. When the one guy was talking about when they went to China, they used a particular approach that was quite, I don't want to say unique, but it's quite effective. Let's put it that way. You remember what it was that they kind of mentioned when what China was already referring to God? How did they refer to the Lord? Yeah, the Lord of heaven. So what they did was they said, okay, what is it that you refer as God, and then build on that. And it's interesting, we had a study before about, we went through Paul's journey just last week, wasn't it? Yeah, last week we went through Paul's journey. One of the things he did, and there was that long section that was the entire sermon. One of the things he did, and I think Peter's always also done this, and a few others that have been recorded, they go in and they describe what it's like to be a Jew, and they talk about principles of a Jew and the principles of this, and you remember this about the Lord, and remember that about the Lord, and remember this. And then, in other words, they talk on a common ground. Then they say, now here's Jesus. And it's interesting that there's an approach that we're using with evangelism called 3 circles. And the first thing you talk about, we live in a broken world. Well, who's not going to agree that we live in a broken world? You know, whether you watch the news, whether you look at broken homes, we live in a broken world. And then you build on that. It's interesting, 2 other tools to work with Muslims. Muslims actually believe a lot of the principles in the Old Testament. The Adam and Eve, Moses and Abraham, and those particular experiences. So you build on that, and then you work into John the Baptist, and then you lead into Jesus. And so there's a lot of approaches that they even used here. And so they found that to be very effective to find out how's God manifesting already, and then build on that. So that's an effective process even in witnessing. So that was really cool. What did the one guy mention about heroism? He was saying that he wrote about heroism relative to Jesuits, and what was that referring to? Do you remember? It wasn't actually the actual action of being a hero, so to speak, but it was more of an attitude than it was an action. Do you remember that? It was the aspect of realizing that there's something bigger, sacrificing something of your own for something bigger. And it was kind of interesting as he talked about that, and able to give up something of your own, maybe your own beliefs or your own practices for something bigger. And that's a principle also that, when we witness, we're actually describing something larger, something bigger than us, when we want folks to know Christ. And so that's an important aspect too that was very common to what we believe. It was interesting. They used the term with living with 1 foot raised. Now, I don't know why. The first thing I think, it's not the Captain Morgan commercial. It's not that type. But it got me thinking about another phrase that we use in starting something. Whenever we want to get something going real quick, we have a phrase that remind me of. It's like hitting the ground running. In other words, always being ready for something. That's what that image reflected with me, was that I'm ready. I got 1 foot ready to just go into the next function, the next activity. And so that was kind of interesting, that aspect too. Near the last point, I really liked how they kind of ended it, and they talked about love. Do you remember how they tied that into it? And one guy even used it in his business, was it J.P. Morgan or Chase? Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, that's a principle that I don't think they teach in managerial classes in business, about loving your people. Now, they talk about respect, and they talk about listening to them, and certain things like that, but they don't, use the word love in business. Oh, no, we can't do that. But that makes a lot of sense. And it says, you have to love those that you lead before you can become a good leader. And that's a great principle. And that also ties into what a good manager is. A good manager is someone who gives credit to his people that actually did the work, right? And then you find a manager that takes all the credit. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, those were some good principles that I thought were really good. And it seems like, I don't know whether it's a millennial attitude or what, but you see kids saying, "Hey, it's all about me. It's all about me." Everything they do, everything they say, "Hey, it's about me." Well, it's not about you. It's about something greater. So that's a good principle too. It's a selflessness type of attitude. So there were a lot of good principles when you go through and you see what the Jesuits were all about. Now, they're the typical Catholic organization, but yet they have a lot of principles that were good to remind us and what they were like. And so, and it wasn't the typical isolated type of Catholics that you think of normally. Any comments